Hello, everyone. How are you today? My name is Carla Gonzalez, and I'm really excited to be doing this presentation on preparing your concept design portfolio with you today. I would like to give just a moment for some other people to possibly join us here. I am curious if you can just post in the chat whether or not you can see my screen. I believe you should be able to see the first page of my presentation. We have with us this afternoon April Seghetti, who is one of our senior admissions counselors here at the College for Creative Studies, working with applicants to guide them and provide feedback on portfolio and the application process. And so April will be on the chat answering questions that might come up as we go through. But I would encourage you to ask questions. And we have a small enough group here today where I can certainly answer questions at the end. The presentation isn't all that long, so we will definitely have time to do Q&A within the scheduled hour, and we can use as much of that time for Q&A as you need. Great, so why don't we go ahead and get started? So I think the important thing to know about developing a concept design portfolio is that the strength of your portfolio really is only limited by your own imagination and the time commitment that you place toward building it. Certainly, we understand creating a portfolio is time consuming, and particularly for a concept design portfolio, because we do have various elements that you are required to include in that portfolio. And so I just want to encourage you to explore, experiment, put the time in, even if it's not like, solid hours and hours and hours of time at once, but consistently coming back to and developing your ideas, whether that's through a sketchbook, whether you were, taking those ideas from a sketchbook to digital tools. But, definitely it's not a one and done. So I'm just encouraging you to kind of work through your ideas and build on some of the successes that you find along the way. So let's see. Okay. I think the key to any really strong concept design portfolio is the story. It is the heart and the inspiration of your work. So it's really important for you to choose a story first off. So that story can be a story that you've written. It can be a story that you've read. It can be, in other words, an existing story. Really, that is up to you. The idea is that you're going to build a new world for that story to live in. So if that means you're creating a visual narrative to convey that story through all the various, characters, environments, accessories, all of those kinds of things that would live within that world. And I think because it all is all based in storytelling, and you are going to convey your story through visual terms, you still want to think about the 8 parts of a good story. And those are setting, character, plot, conflict, theme, point of view, tone, and style. So I'm going to work through each of those elements a little bit with some visual, reference here for you guys. These are works that were submitted in previous application portfolios for the concept design program. And then just to let you know, I am mixing up a few portfolios in the presentation, but what I'd like to do at the end, right before we get into the Q&A, is go through 2 portfolios from start to finish, because I think that'll give you a better sense of how it gets all put together into one unified presentation. So just take this first part as sort of elements, right, of things that we're trying to get you to think about and consider when you're making your work. So setting, it's where and when your story takes place. and what that looks and feels like. And remember, just because a story was originally written for a medieval village doesn't mean that it needs to live in a medieval village in your version of this story. It could, exist today, or it could be in the future, or it could have been in the 1950s, right? Where you have some really obvious kinds of visual cues, themes, and elements that you could incorporate into that story based on a particular time period. So you get to choose that. That's where your freedom comes in, working with an existing story, is that you can put it in whatever time, place, and space that you feel is, functional for your vision of that story. So you want to think about the spaces that your characters will have adventures in, how the setting impacts all the other elements of your story. Is it, futuristic vehicles? Is it old, wagons? Is it, self-driving cars? Are people using guns or swords or both? Are they modern swords or old swords? Are they lasers, right? Like all of those things are choices you get to make based on the setting that you've decided or chosen for your story. Characters. It's important that your characters convey a sense of who they are. So not only what they look like, but how they come across to other people. So attitude. How do they think? What are their perspectives on this world that you're creating? And how can you convey that through their body language, their body shape, their attitude? Notice the face on this character, I think, is a really, it's a small but super important and insightful element to this character. And so when you're devising or developing your character, think about how they fit within the story. Are they the protagonist? Are they the antagonist? Are they the good guy or the bad guy? Are they a key figure or a supplemental or secondary figure within the story? And how do they, how does a protagonist visually stand out from a secondary character, right? So if you can imbue ideas about how they make decisions, but also how characters interact, right? So if you have a protagonist and a secondary character, are there situations that they come face to face, and how do they interact with one another? Are they friends and friendly and have strategic contact, or are they enemies and are they battling each other emotionally, mentally, or physically, right? So there are lots of nuances within a character that you can use to help further and convey the story. I think one thing that applicants tend to shy away from, and I want to encourage you not to shy away from this, is to include the plot of your story in your portfolio. There is absolutely nothing wrong with including writing in your visual art portfolio, especially if you're using a story that maybe isn't familiar to people, or we don't always want to assume that everybody knows the story. So including a page like this one that includes the story outline, maybe some context, background of the story or of the characters, or why this story is taking a place, like why this event is happening, right? To set the stage for the visual elements of the story in your portfolio. So typically a plot page like this might show up early in a portfolio, but then also you'll see throughout the various examples I'm going to continue with, you will see snippets of a story on a given page that will help, again, build some additional context around what you're trying to convey visually. So keep that in mind, and I encourage you to include something like this in your portfolio. Okay, conflict. So conflict, obviously, in a good story, you're going to have some conflict. It's the highlight of the story, perhaps, or one of the highlights. It moves the story along. It helps convey this, from the movement of the story from beginning to end, right? You can't just, you want action to happen. You want things to occur. So your conflicts are moving the story along, and depicting those conflicts is really a great way to help us better understand and to convey that narrative of the story visually. So use keyframes. This is called a keyframe. It's sort of a depiction of a particular moment in a story that is of importance. So for example, this is called the capture. Obviously, this is depicting the capture of one character by another. And it's very simplistic in that it's showing, but it is a plot point that is an integral to the story. So you notice the writing at the bottom of the graphic here, that's included in the page being presented as part of the portfolio. And it says, this is the pivotal point in the story where the torch is passed from Khan to John. Apprehended in the temple turned meth lab, right? Again, additional context. Khan is incapacitated for the remaining part of the story. Oh, he's tied up for the rest of the story. Okay. And John takes up his mantle and rescues him from his predicament. So it's showing how the characters are interacting. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? How one is taking control of the other. Obviously, all of those things. But the important part here is the visual element, where you see how color comes into play to convey power within this frame, right? Red, very strong and very visually stands out from the rest of the image layout or the design or composition of that graphic. And then you also have this perspective from the character who has their hands handcuffed behind their back, obviously is from a lower vantage point looking up at the characters who are in control. You can also note that this drawing is not very hyper detailed. It's a little bit more suggestive, a little bit more about the emotion of the moment. The lighting is really important because we can see that this space is sort of a nefarious kind of not great, not a very positive space. And so you can share a lot of that context of the story through the visual elements you're using to depict this moment. Oops, sorry, I went twice. So theme is another element that you need to keep in mind when you are developing this world, because your theme are those visual cues that are going to carry through and across the story and apply to all of the elements of your story. It can include repeated motifs or designs, visual distinctions that support the storyline. So just as an example, these are 3 pages of a single portfolio. And this lower image, the larger image, is the initial introductory page of the portfolio. You'll notice it has the emblem for the United States Army. It looks like it's a case file, right? It's got these visual cues that provide some context for the story. These visual cues can be whatever you want, but the idea is to find something and then utilize that across the portfolio to unify it and make sure it's something that is relevant to the story. Also, you'll see in these smaller images on the left, that case file kind of motif carries through, but also this idea of using the emblems, right? You can see that on both of these smaller pages. Also on the introductory page, the larger image, you can see the very heavy metal, army type equipment and, that style of accessory comes across in the other pages of the portfolio. So in the lower left, you'll see that very heavy metal kind of feeling for accessories is being utilized for small objects that a character would utilize, but also for larger objects that live within that story. Point of view. Point of view is really important to help us understand the character's relationship to one another or to the spaces they're in, to the power structures happening within your story. So getting, looking at elements of your story from far away or from close up helps convey those different points of view. The differences between seeing something and understanding the implications of that thing. So if you think about this image here, again, you're showing a character very far left foreframe, looking up at this very large looming structure. And so it's very clear that there is a power dynamic happening here, but also not just between this one primary character that would be in the left foreground, but with all the other characters that are suggested in the middle ground, right? So this is not just one person against a larger power. It is multiple people. It is a community of people who are being overlorded by this power source. And so you have to think about it in terms of, movie frames, if you will, right? So how do we think as a cinematographer might, or how do you convey what a director might want an audience to understand in a given shot? And so using those ideas in the visual presentations of these elements of a story are really important. Also, notice in the upper right, these little silhouettes here. These are what we call silhouette studies, and they are suggestions of how this larger structure, how it's been imagined by you through your process of developing a sort of a final idea, right? So it's kind of like your sketch work. We do like to see these little sketches in here because it helps us see that you have considered various shapes, forms, and ideas for the solution to this. And then you did sort of finalize, well, I'm going to take this one and I'm going to develop it out into this. And it just helps us see how you got from one idea to the next. And you'll see this silhouette study in multiple pages coming forward. And so that is an element that we like to see. And I'll touch on this again as we move through here. So, okay, tone. I think it's really important to sort of not be afraid to depict some elements of your portfolio in hyper detail, but you can also feel comfortable presenting some ideas within the same portfolio as very loose or suggestive. So here are some examples of work from the same portfolio, but with different attitudes or tones in them. You can see, obviously, these architectural drawings are like super realistic. It's obvious that this artist really enjoyed this part of making, these ideas come to life. So maybe this artist's strength is architecture. And, we do recognize that some, in your portfolio, you may have strengths in one area, and you may have produced work in all of the areas we're asking for, but you may have strengths here or there. We understand that, and that's okay, because when you come to our program, you will learn how to strengthen the other areas that maybe you haven't been able to develop yet, or that you, need to continue to build skills for. So, but back to tone. These grayscale variation studies up here in the upper right, you can see these are not hyper detailed at all, like the lower right illustration, right? They are digitally done. They are looking more at a suggestion of a space and shapes. It is, like I said, a gray tone variation study. You're looking at lighting and perspective and space and how we might feel walking through some of these spaces that you're devising for your story. So you should feel comfortable approaching various parts of your portfolio in these different ways. Here's another example of tone where we're looking at color palette and texture palette. Again, consistency across the portfolio is really important. And so if you're choosing, you need to really choose a color palette and a texture palette so that you can create those consistencies on purpose, right? Consistency is not an accident. Consistency is a choice. And so making sure that even though your characters are enemies, or one is a beast and one is a man, or one is a woman, you need to make sure that visually they all work together in the same world. So that means your, now here's an example. So, well, I'll talk about lighting in a moment, but so your materials all have to be kind of from the same time period, unless you have an alien returning, you know, going back in time and showing up, and obviously they need to look completely different. But, you know, that needs to be a purposeful decision. And so choosing a color palette, choosing a texture palette, and repeating those tones, textures, colors consistently where appropriate and when appropriate across the story really builds a sense of unity to the entire presentation. Tone also refers to lighting. And so, like I mentioned, if you are depicting various parts or environments of a story, you're going to want to consider the lighting. And should it be the same or should it be different? What is the, and why are they different? And is the lighting conveying one idea differently than another? And how does lighting do that? Is the lighting really harsh with lots of really hard shadows? Or is the lighting very soft and gentle and simply falling and casting very gentle shadows, right? Those, are, again, need to be purposeful decisions that you make as you are developing the spaces and environments that your characters live, work, and breathe in. Style. Again, another element that needs to be addressed consistently across your portfolio. Your style needs to be relevant to the time, place, and space of the story. So as you choose a story, in the early parts of choosing a story, you should begin to develop a style that you will apply across all of the things you do next, right? So if you come up with style at the end of your portfolio, you're going to have to redo the whole portfolio. So keep that in mind. Your style is going to need to be consistent. Now, that said, we will recognize that a sketch, a grayscale sketch, you know, versus a color sketch versus a final rendering, they can all look different. But if we're looking for style consistency, you'll see, are we using, you know, are the roofing tiles consistent across the architecture that's being presented here, for example? Is the roof styles, the house styles, the wood detail across the front of the structures are similar, right? Because you're trying to build a sense of a unified place or space. So keeping all of those elements of style in mind are really important, again, as you're working through all of your elements. Here's another example of style in a totally different world. And this is, I put this here so you can see, like, you get to choose the style, But you need to be consistent with that style, and it needs to be applied across your characters, your accessories, your environments, your architecture, all of those kinds of things. These examples also, again, notice the silhouettes up in the corner here. The final rendering tends usually on these layouts to be the larger full color image. And then there's ideation, which is the various forms that you considered for this item. And then even sometimes there may be a line drawing. Often some of these, if there are unique elements or functionalities of this thing, might have little drawn arrows with some sketch notes like, arms convert to cannons, or, joints are double jointed. They can bend either way, whatever it is that works for your characters. But it's those unique elements that help us better understand how this creature would move or function. And those small elements are really fun, right? They bring that much more energy to your work. So share those small ideas if you feel that they're unique elements that are going to help your story and your visual communication move forward. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about preparing your presentation, and then I will show you the full portfolios, 2 full portfolios, and they're fairly long. So, but I think it's going to help you see them start to finish. So when you're preparing your presentation, we're encouraging you to cluster your work into sections. So you're going to have a section for environments, you're going to have a section for characters, architecture, and hardware. Hardware really includes anything like vehicles, accessories, props, weapons, any of those kinds of hard surface items. And listen, vehicles don't always have to be hard surface, right? They could be bubbles, I don't know. But you do want to group those together so that we can look at them in these sections. We do want you to include inspiration images. Doesn't have to be a lot. They could be inspiration for the material that the costumes of your characters are made out of, or inspiration images for the environments or a tree that you've designed, right? This isn't very specific, but we do find that if you include images that really, really kind of, you went, oh, yeah, like I totally want to combine these 2 images together to make my own thing, then include those. Silhouette studies, as I pointed out, are really important to help us understand how you moved from one concept for how to design this thing, from one concept to the next, to the next, to the next, to the final. So usually it's at least like 3 or 4 silhouette studies. Grayscale variations are helpful. And the silhouettes can literally just be like black silhouettes, right, of your character holding something, moving, different shapes of their cape, or, things like that. Grayscale variations are where you begin to give it a little bit of dimensionality so that we can understand the bulk and the weight of things a little bit differently than just in the plain silhouette. And then final renderings would be like a full color rendering of your final choice that you've selected out of your various ideations. And then keyframes of plot points, like I mentioned at the very beginning, is showing us a rendered depiction of key points of your story is really helpful. And then again, don't be afraid to include small snippets of your story that support the visual choices you're making. So that's literally the text from the story or whatever you might have written about, a synopsis or analysis of a small moment within a story. We do encourage you to create as many pages as you require, but you should edit your work. We don't want to see every possible solution. We want you to show us the solutions you thought were the best ones and then the final ones, right? So edit your work. Multi-page PDFs are preferable. on the CCS slide room, you are required to submit multiple PDFs. Our suggestion is that you can create a PDF of your environments, a PDF of your characters, a PDF of your architecture, a PDF of your hardware, for example. You could upload every single page separately if you prefer. But one thing to keep in mind, and I know that this is really, it's going to happen because when you're rendering illustrations digitally, for example, like we've seen, they can be very large files. But when you are turning them into a PDF, there is a way to minimize the resolution for the PDF. And this allows the file to remain at a usable size and they are not too large. So if they are too large, they will get, you won't be able to upload them to SlideRoom. So just keep in mind trying to pare down the resolution overall of that multi-page PDF is going to help you avoid that issue on SlideRoom. And then also, I'm really just encouraging you to use a horizontal layout for 11 by 17 inches. Most of the things you've seen already in this presentation are horizontal orientation. If you think about it, we're talking about storytelling, we're talking about narratives, we're talking about movie screen shape. We are talking about reading left to right, those kinds of things. So if you can keep it in a horizontal layout, you're going to find that that's going to work best. And obviously the 11 by 17 is giving you more space to work with than an 8.5 by 11 vertical, for example. Okay, so I'm going to give you, I'm going to switch my screen share here, and I am going to show you some example portfolios. I'm not going to show you all of these, but these are the titles of the portfolios that I have been sharing with you. But I am going to show you this. Okay, so screen. Okay, are you all seeing my Sword in the Stone portfolio? All right, this is the synopsis page. You'll see, I'm just going to kind of let it run because otherwise it'll take too long. You can see the layouts. These are inspiration images, the silhouettes, but then also final renderings of the character. You can see this is the same approach for each character that is being presented in the portfolio. And I think that's important. We don't just want to see one character. We'd like to see multiple because we want to see how they compare and or would work with one another visually in a story. And so, if you're doing small studies about the tattoos of the forehead, that's cool, right? Those are the fun little elements of things that you get to make choices about. The crowns, for example. And then we always want to see what you end up with. Notice the various shapes of the dress or the, and then color, right? What is this character's motif color? What do they look like? So then this is a prop section. You'll see the silhouette studies. You'll see all the ideations and various options that this artist worked through and then their final choice. Again, the silhouettes, the ideations, the final rendering. And you'll notice that some of these final renderings are not in color, and that is okay. We do want to see some final renderings in color, but not all of them have to be in color. That's where those gray variation studies can help you move towards a final rendering that's in black and white, and that's okay. You'll see there are some details pulled out so that we can get a sense of the inside of that wagon, the various shapes for the ship, different perspectives on the ship. And then now's the environment section. They're going to focus on Merlin's jungle and the city of Camelot. Notice that the frames that were orange outlined were the ones that the artist decided to create renderings of. Notice the incorporation of lighting for these spaces and considering those things. as you move towards a rendering. And again, some of these are not hyper detailed. It's okay. It may be about the mood, understanding that there's grass and stone or moss together versus shiny hard metal surfaces, right? And again, suggestive. And then notice the total switch. So environments were very suggestive, soft, and then the architecture is the same artist, same portfolio, very hyper detailed. So those things are okay. And again, when showing this Kingdom of Camelot, these are different perspectives and points of view on the actual kingdom versus the city itself. So notice now they're moving into the city. So these are closer in views of the city or spaces and places within the city that could be incorporated. Now, I do want to say that we are showing you an exceptional portfolio, okay? Not all submissions are this thorough, but I'm showing you this one because there's so much variety in how the artist is presenting their world. And I want you to see all the variations so that you can get inspired, not deterred, inspired and excited about the options that you have for working on your own portfolio. Okay, so I am going to now show you this portfolio. Okay, again, it should just run. This is the synopsis of the story, introduces the protagonist. You'll notice the character studies here, ideation. You should consider that there are various shapes for your character before you get to your final one. As with your accessories and your vehicles and your props, there could be hundreds of ways of moving forward with an idea. We just kind of want to see what you think are your best ideas, and then again, moving that to more of a final. These grayscale, these are just using like really simple textures. We do like to consider the insides of spaces if they are significant to the story. Sometimes that helps, again, convey more context for your characters and your stories. Again, style has shifted here. It's a different story, different spaces, different feeling. Depictions of the inside, what all this is. Conflict point of the story. This is a keyframe. Understanding how those spaces work and the significance of those spaces. You remember I mentioned this is a meth lab, right? But the meth lab is in the basement and upstairs it's a temple. So, showing that contradiction is important. And this is unrelated work that the student included, but just kind of wanted you to see that as well. So at this point, I am happy to answer